Section 19 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, Berlioz. Beethoven died in 1827, and it was during the last part of his life, the beginning of the 19th century, that a number of musicians were growing up who are all now famous. Berlioz, Chopin, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Liszt, and Wagner were all born within 10 years of each other, and each is now well known to all lovers of music. The earliest of these, the greatest musician France has ever produced, was Hector Berlioz, 1803 to 1869. The son of a country doctor, he was brought up with hardly any musical education, and his pleasure in some of Gluck's music, which he found in his father's library, was regarded with disfavor by his family. His father and mother were each strongly opposed to his becoming a musician, and when the time came for him to study for a profession, he was sent to Paris to learn medicine. His music came from his own passionate love of sound, the force of his imagination, and his burning desire to produce in music, with all the beauty he could, the feelings that possessed him. Musicians naturally studied, and still study as part of their training, harmony, the combining of sounds into masses, and counterpoint, the combining of melodies together. Of such studies Berlioz knew nothing until he was nearly 20, when he studied for a time at the Paris Conservatoire. In Berlioz's music, the harmony and counterpoint are not the most interesting part. The power and originality of his music lie in his amazing understanding of the orchestra and his wonderful rhythmic sense. He understood the capacities of the different instruments better than the people who played them, and the certainty and clearness with which he combined their various sounds were entirely his own. His life was a constant struggle with poverty and the difficulties of producing his works. He lived for months at a time on the simplest food, such as bread and raisins, saving all he could to pay for performances of his music. In order to make the small sum necessary for living, he had to sing in an opera chorus, to give lessons, and to write newspaper articles. When he produced his first works, he spent 16 hours a day copying the parts for the orchestra players. He had unusual difficulty over producing his works. For one thing, he wrote for a very large number of players, sometimes for choir as well, and when such numbers of performers had to be paid for rehearsals and performance, the cost was very great. Also, the originality of his music was so startling that conductors of his time did not understand it. Only a few of the best musicians of the day were capable of appreciating it, and some of the well-known musicians in Paris hated his innovations and opposed him in every possible way. However, Berlioz's spirit was indomitable. If a performance went badly, he would at once organize another, borrow money, find a hall, and work with incredible energy until every performer completely understood what he had to perform, and then would come a triumphant success. For each time he produced his work, played as he meant it to be played, the effect was instantaneous. The audience was carried away, and the players themselves were enthusiastic. The strain, however, was great. The rehearsals were very hard work, and the performance once over, Berlioz had to start again to earn by drudgery the money which enabled him to pay what he had borrowed and to live while he wrote new works. Berlioz's continual efforts were not only in the cause of his own music. He also fought to get the works of others properly performed. He was one of the first musicians who, not knowing Beethoven personally, yet really understood him. When Beethoven's symphonies were played in Paris, many alterations were made, conductors and editors saying that certain passages were ugly or not according to accepted rules. Such passages, played as Beethoven wrote them, are now considered original and moving, and Berlioz comprehended Beethoven's poetical power and fought to have his works accurately and perfectly performed. When Berlioz won a prize at the Conservatoire, he was entitled to a seat in the opera house at every performance. Here he did good work, for his love for the operas of Gluck, Weber, and other composers had led him to study and know their work intimately. When he heard performances with passages changed and instruments left out, He would begin to make sarcastic and angry comments out loud. Other members of the audience were roused to interest, sometimes even to uproar, and the next time that particular opera was given, there were no omissions or alterations. With Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, the shape or form of a symphony, sonata, and quartet was definite and in some ways fixed. The first movement or piece had a first theme, then a second theme, then a section where these themes were heard in different ways, and the themes were repeated at the end. This made a symmetrical shape, and each shape was used and expanded by these great composers. Among Beethoven's later works are several where the symmetry and shape give way and wonderful passages of sound occur, like periods of transition and expectancy. Music moving and uplifting, and not depending in any way on shape or form, just pure sound, moving according to some powerful feeling and conveying that feeling as we listen to it. Such music where the sound produced emotion without any regular return of the themes or any fixed shape was rare in works for instruments. Bach had produced such instrumental music, so had Beethoven, but music of this kind was more usual in opera, where, interest being concentrated on the words and actions of the story, the music had only to convey the emotions of the drama, and any fixed return of a theme was unnecessary, and might have been quite out of place if a theme expressed a certain emotion and the story moved quickly on to other emotions and other situations. Such music showed, however, that the special symmetrical shapes which had been developed for sonatas and symphonies were only, as it were, a mold into which composers had poured their feelings, and new shapes were developing independently of these special arrangements of the themes. Just as in Berlioz's music, his rhythms and use of instruments were quite original, and an outcome of his powerful imagination and vivid feelings. So the shape of the pieces he wrote was his own. He once set the play Romeo and Juliet to music. He did not produce an opera as other musicians would have done, but he chose certain moments in the story which powerfully affected him, and produced a piece of music for each of those moments, full of freshness, spontaneity, and dramatic beauty. Moments that to other musicians might have been insignificant gave him the occasion for some lovely creation, as when Queen Mab is mentioned, just a passing comment on the story, but to Berlioz the occasion for a fairy-like composition. Berlioz's music is only now beginning to be well known and its great beauties recognized. His choice of subjects on which to write his music was unusual. In La Symphonie Fantastique, the 5 movements are called Dreams and Passions, The Ball, Pastoral, March to the Scaffold, and Dream of a Witch's Orgy. The music to each is vivid and quite unlike the set movements of an ordinary symphony, but each is a piece of music with poetic intensity of expression. If Berlioz's music was vivid, his life was no less so, a life of many conflicts, of dramatic moments, and of passionate devotion to his art and to the few people he loved. His conflicts were innumerable, and were sometimes very amusing. Soon after he arrived in Paris, he went to the Conservatoire library to read the scores of Gluck's operas. A score is music for orchestra, the part for each instrument being written out separately, each below the other. Music so printed takes a great deal of space. Copies are also usually very expensive and are generally only owned by libraries or wealthy musicians. Berlioz had not noticed that students were required to enter by a special door, and he had paid no attention to the porter who tried to stop him entering by the wrong door, so that he was surprised a short time afterwards by the principal, a well-known musician named Cherubini, who, enraged that a young man should ignore his rules, ordered the porter to turn him out. Berlioz would not submit to such treatment. He ran round the library, jumping over tables and chairs, chased by the porter and the angry Cherubini, and finally dashed out of the door, saying he would soon come back to study more scores, which indeed he did. It was not the first nor the last of his conflicts. When he had obtained his father's permission to study music, and that only after great difficulty and misery, his mother left home and refused to see him again because she disapproved of such a career. Berlioz followed her to the house of a relation to which she had gone, but in vain, and he had to leave for Paris in the face of her antagonism. The times when he wrote music were happy, but the times of performance were a continual struggle. First to collect enough performers, then to find that some were jealous of others, then that some were accustomed to their own conductor and would even make willful mistakes rather than play for a new composer. There were constant pitfalls to be guarded against. Sometimes, if he employed a copyist, there were wrong notes to be corrected. Sometimes some meddlesome enemy would change the instruments as they lay ready for a performance, and confusion would result. Even to get a hall was difficult, and after surmounting all these difficulties, the concert might end in failure. But Berlioz's belief in his music never failed. If disaster happened, he began all over again, and with even greater efforts, carried all to a successful conclusion. Only once did he fail to do so. His wife was ill when a long new orchestral work came into his head. He foresaw the months of poverty while he arranged for its performance, and he felt sure that money needed by his wife would be spent on producing his new work if he wrote it. He refused to listen to his inspiration. Time after time the beautiful melodies and effects came to him, and time after time he refused to listen, and this work of his was never written. Once, when a student, he saw Liszt standing in the audience clapping with enthusiasm. Once later in life, after a successful concert, he was in the artist's room, prostrate with fatigue, when Paganini entered, led him back to the hall, and in the presence of the orchestra and those of the audience still applauding, knelt and kissed his hand. The day after this event, Berlioz, really ill in bed, was visited by Paganini's son, who came with a note from his father giving Berlioz a large sum of money as a gift. It was a gift that set him free for some time from the worst of his daily cares, free to write music. Berlioz was devoted to Paris, and never happy away from it, though he had successful tours in Russia, Germany, and England, and though he made money in other countries and not in his own. The greatest blow he ever had was the death of his son Louis, and from that he never recovered. He died in Paris in 1869. The few works of Berlioz that are occasionally performed are orchestral, but he wrote several operas, and the last, Les Troyens, which is in 2 parts and takes 2 evenings to perform, is full of noble and beautiful music. It has very seldom been heard, but it is music worthy of the famous stories it accompanies, and worthy, too, of Berlioz's genius, which is only very slowly and gradually becoming known and appreciated as it deserves. The simplicity and grandeur, the passionate feeling and uplifted outlook in Les Troyens, and the clearness and certainty with which Berlioz wrote the effects and sounds he wanted, all these combine to make 2 very beautiful works which cannot easily be compared with other operas, but which show extraordinary individual and epic beauty. End of section 19 of Music by Ursula Creighton, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, March 16, 2024.